it's an off and on relationship, but we have I greatly respect and admire her for her scholarship. And in fact, it would have been nice if they could have shared, we had some of her books on display. It's very fascinating. The work she has done on gender and slavery and law in colonial India, for instance, and the subsequent work. So basically, she has tried to bring the marginal center stage. And I think today's lecture would be a continuation of that same enterprise. I think basically they would call it salvage literature. I remember a phrase from salvage history. I remember a phrase from Foucault where he talks about the administration of silence. And this is generally what has happened to much of women's rights, women's writing. And in fact, I think she has got this very interesting idea where she says that first they destroyed the documents relating to land holdings of women, and then subsequently they were thrown into the kind of the dustbins of history, so that they are forgotten. So it's actually a double project. First you destroy, and then you kind of unperson these women, and that's how I think it's basically been salvage history. And I now leave it to Indrani to take the matter further.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you for that wonderful and generous introduction. And thank you, Mahesh, for inviting me to this place. It has wonderful memories for me. I used to be a member here. I have had lots of friends here. Alas, I haven't visited here to speak to this distinguished audience. And it's wonderful to see old friends here, long-standing friends, and to welcome new ones, of course. So, thank you. This is a delightful opportunity. What I'm going to talk about here today is part distillation of a project that I've just completed and is coming out shortly from OUP under the title Forgotten Friends. It's about monks, memories, and the marriages that have been forgotten across Northeast India. But this talk today is only part of that. It's also part distillation of a much grander, and some of you might even say more grandiose, attempt at writing a broader history of patriarchy and its impact in the making of Indian history that I'm now beginning in my next project. So let me begin with the distillation of the project that I've just completed. That is where I talk about monastic governmentality. All of you have heard about Foucault. You all know Foucault's work on governmentality. I am developing upon Foucault in two very clear and distinct ways. So let me read those parts for you and then proceed to elaborate. Foucault had defined governmentality to refer to the conduct of conduct. After 1982, he refined his argument to suggest that governmentality was made up of a set of ascetic exercises through which the knowledge of the self and the care of the self was simultaneously learnt. The other was indispensable for the practice of the self and existed in training. The other was the master who trained the young Greek governor to be in the care of the self. The trained governor would then be equipped to extend the care of the self to the care of others. Foucault, however, said nothing either about the governor-in-waiting's mother or sister, nor the teacher's wives and daughters. The household was entirely absent from governmentality. In the workshop household model that P.V. Kani excavated from classical texts, a teacher, or acharya, presided over a cluster of pupils and disciples in an establishment where they lived together. Acharya Kula, another old friend. Co-residence involved physical proximities, some social intimacies, and constituted the domain of subjectivation and submission of the students to the disciplines of body and mind. necessary for any craft. So South Asian, what I'm calling South Asian monastic governmentality, diverges from Foucauldian governmentality in key essentials. The place of women and the household in the generation of authority, and a secondary trope which I'm not going to explore over here is the centrality of narrative, of legend in the imparting of skills. Those of you who might wonder about it might look at, say, Janice Joni's work on the Panchatantra and such literature, which is actually fables about governance. And so I'm not going to develop that argument here. I'll just focus on the place of women-centered households as fundamental. So in thinking also monasticity in the South Asian perspective. I have predecessors in this. Malavika is sitting here. Vijay Pinch's work is very important in this, so I'm not novel. I'm in fact developing upon their work already done. In ordinary post-Reformation English usage, the term monk has implied vows of celibacy. Therefore, non-celibate, consecrated or ordained figures in lineages of tantric, Bauddha, Shaiva, Vaishnava and Sufi Muslims in South Asia have seldom been identified as monastic. But most monks, such as those identified by latest archaeological work, say done by Gorisha, Chatterjee and others, on the Pala, on the Buddhist Chandra, on various Nepali sort of archaeological sites, show us very clearly that there were women associated with the household of the Acharyas. Many of these women also gave gifts of different kinds, and these happen to be those found in the terrain, statues, idols, etc. So if not celibacy, what defines monasticity? According to Chatterjee, it was a form of exercise associated with distinct sites. He translated the Tibetan term pompa and the Sanskrit term aranyaka as monasterium or site of refuge, set apart from all other buildings and dedicated to the exercises necessary for the cultivation of a discipline or ascetic. Now, if you think about the term site of refuge and think about it in Persian or any other cognate, you will immediately recognize the valence of the term haram over here. That is a site of refuge. It is a sacred site, it is a site of refuge. And I'm guided by Suchi, Gellner and many others in deploying monasticity in this very way, in this monasterium, to complicate and erase the division between public, private, domestic, public, etc. matters that have muddied our thinking in South Asia about what is actually the political state. Okay? So, I'm deploying monasticity in this way to qualify the form of governmentality in South Asia that took the labors of women-centered households as integral to the production of both skill and people. Monastic teaching lineages took the presence of such generations and different kinds of women in the workshop establishment for granted, and I will begin my work from there. There is a tripartite model of governmentality that I'm thinking of. In the book, it is summed up in three ways. One, there is the aspect of a ritual order of some act of some kind, an act of initiation, which begins or establishes a political relationship between the teacher and the disciple, student. These forms of initiation are common to Mahayana, Shaiva, even later devotional, that is bhakti, and Bon, as well as Sufi silsilas. So empowerment and initiation rituals are first. Second, the implication of accepting initiation was equivalent to submission to a legal, moral, and disciplinary practice that was identified with particular teachers. So initiation committed disciples to certain physical, mental observances under the direction of a teacher, guru. This, and I want to emphasize this very strongly, instead of autonomy, therefore, each school cultivates this ideal of dependence, of conformity, or obedience as political order, enacted by adherence towards deities and teachers, from whom they accepted instructions on righteous and unrighteous conduct. This cultivation of dependence was therefore the value, and it varied by particular age and condition. And the third aspect of this form of governmentality is that it shapes a codependence fundamental to the working out of a political economy. Now, this political economy of monastic governmentality is crucial to keep in mind, because it simultaneously is the most materially evident aspect of this order in the terrain, in the historical record, and it is simultaneously the most ignored by post-colonial historians of 18th and 19th century. So let me explain what this is. This is the concept of dan and dakshina. From the 2nd century onwards, Mahayana Buddhist lineages had required male subjects to work at a range of disciplines such as clerical writing, craft working, construction, military labor. Sometimes this labor was itself a way of buying shelter and subsistence for indigent, able-bodied young men. When these things were exchanged in return for a particular performance, they were called dakshina. Anything outside of that was gift. This was the concept of dan. It gained invisible futurity or merit, and there has been an enormous body of work, recently of course by Michael Walsh, on merit as a commodity which must be seen and studied. He's of course coming at it from the Central Asian and Buddhist Song period and dynasty, but he is arguing very strongly that we must look at merit as a form of medieval, pre-modern investment, an act of investment and a commodity that therefore has multiple both here and future return. And that's the concept which is also being translated by a whole body of scholars in Central Asia who are working on the late Sasanian and the early Islamic translations of merit and khairah and other such concepts, and how this is working out in that terrain at that time. So I'm drawing upon that scholarship to say that that is exactly what we find everywhere in the material evidence as well as in the record. Unfortunately, this is not very widely studied, at least not for the region that I know a little bit about, which is Eastern India, where from, and this is where I'm going to make the jump into the next part of the paper, which is the making of colonial misogyny. From the 17th century, and definitely from the records of 1720, we can find enormous numbers of gifts, both to women. One group of women are the Gosain, women in the Gosain lineages, and the second set of gifts to women are in the category called Deva, that is widows. So both initiated women or women in the monastic household as well as widows are recipients of fairly substantial Mughal and provincial, imperial as well as sub-imperial gifts of land and income generated from those lands. The reason that this is important is because many of these women are also in the record both gifting out of those products and lands and grain, at the same time that many of them are also mortgaging some of these gifts of land and grain for future or for particular purposes, which I don't have the time to sort of draw elaborate conclusions from, but they are all in the records that I have seen in the West Bengal State Archives and elsewhere. These are in the Bade Jameen Daftar records. These are Panas, and those of you who read script can go and find them for yourself. There are at least 30 registers. Each register takes about 16,000 such entries, and there are 30 of them lodged in the West Bengal State Archives. So those of you who are interested in finding some of these can certainly go and ask for them. I was fortunate. This round I managed to get them. So what we find from these records is from between 1720s and 1750s Eastern India, there's an enormous therefore stake in gift giving that is developed by the widows. So fundamental is this gift giving that if you trace their connections to the various men associated with them, you will automatically find some kind of monastic warrior sampradaya at the heart of this in a fort somewhere. And this is particularly true if you trace Bardhaman, Midnapur, Chittagong into northern Bengal, Dinajpur and Rangpur. There is a kind of direct line between the Himalayan trade routes and the coastal depots. You can draw a direct line of such monastic akhadas and forts commanded by women in the gift of elderly women, but manned by men. And these are monastic warriors of different kinds. Obviously, one last aspect of this kind of gift that I want to touch upon here is the gift of the self, the gift of the body. Now, the gift of the body is something that was known to us from the Lotus Sutra, right from the 2nd century onwards, but we don't have very many regional language descriptions, and I'm going to rely on Vijaya to correct me on this, but I have not come across too many regional language narratives or descriptions of such gift in action. But work in, say, Chinese historiography has shown us that monks used to offer their bodies in gifts in protest against various kinds of imperial constraints on them when emperors were withdrawing the stipends of monks or withdrawing lands from these monasteries. Various of these monks would set themselves on fire in order to put the fear of the future into such imperial administration and force them to enlarge their compassion, that is basically restore the lands, etc. In other words, there is a very strong history of giving the body in gift, of setting it as a sacrifice against a restoration of material goods and fortune. If you look closely at the Tipura household monastic government records, now I hope you know that the Tipura household is what we find Tipura is an old Nepali, East Nepali dynasty. It controlled and set up alliances with an entire range of societies extending right into modern day Tripura and into what is today Bangladesh, that is Bakarganj, Kumila, all those places, where, by the way, they continue to speak a kind of mixed Tibetan, Newari Bangla to this day. So what we find here is that there is a record, a series of verse narratives which describe precisely this kind of protest suicide conducted by women against the Mughal armies which are coming in and trying to withdraw various kinds of land from the monks who are opposing the Mughal army coming southward. So when I found that kind of description in the Rajamala and in the Krishnamala, I began to wonder whether or not conditions in post-1750s, 1760s Eastern India offered an exact parallel for the conduct of such extreme acts of gift of the self. Okay? Were there conditions in the late 18th century which would have prompted certain kinds of women to conduct these extreme acts of protest by giving up their bodies in this way? That was the question that drove me to the archive. Of course, after this it becomes a very simple answer. Of course there were. Because from 1750s itself, okay, or even 1740s, the East India Company, and this is a full 15 years before the grant of the Diwani, okay, the East India Company had been given land in Chittagong, Bardhaman, Midnapur. They were supposed to act exactly like other armies before them and extracted revenue and grain to keep themselves afloat in as other armies before them had done. The East India Company, of course, changed the rules of the game and began to, in fact, defeat exactly those monastic warriors whom they were supposed to replicate. And the attack on the monastic field, the gifts that each monasterium had, all of these were the first objects of East India government, East India Company's form of land revenue government. This is what is called resumption of rent-free tenure or rent-free land. These are actually attacks on monastic warriors. But they're not just attacks on monastic warriors. Attacks on these monastic armies immediately meant attacks on the women who had supported these men. There were two groups of women. One group were the patrons, the elders, the dowagers, for instance, many of whom were widows. In Bardhaman, in Chitrasen's widow had devoted entire 280 bighas of Deori land to the upkeep of such monastic militias. In Dinajpur, in Midnapur, Moinachur, all senior women like Rani Shiromani, like Rani Januki, various important women who come up in the record had in fact patronized this network of courts. So this elder group of dowagers were instantly threatened by the attack of the company. But there were the other women, the humbler women, the women who were in the households of these monastic militants themselves. Okay? These women were especially thrown into very difficult conditions precisely because their livelihood began to be taken away by the policy of land resumption. And gradually these various humbler groups of widows became more and more pushed into this corner. By 1770s, they were dependent on the elder dowager widows themselves, who were again under siege. And a series of very difficult but understudied confrontations occurred all over North to West Bengal at this time. Anybody who has read of the Midnapur Chuar rebellion of 1799, anyone who has read the reports of Phokir Shonnashi attacking in various ganges, various market towns in North Bengal, knows that this is the exact terrain in which the women are actually the major power holders who are authorizing and sponsoring a lot of these rebellions and attacks. So, by 1780, a fairly well worked out policy is put forward, which it's initiated by Shore, John Shore in the council, but it has the blessings of Warren Hastings, and it becomes law from 1784, by which women, both as managers of such landed estates as well as proprietors, i.e. zamindars, are disqualified from both management and authority as zamindars. They cannot own land in such zamindaris in their own name. So this is the beginning, or rather formalization, of colonial misogyny, where structurally, I'm not talking about behavior, I'm not talking about individual men's behavior towards women, I'm talking about a structure of colonial misogyny where women are, being a woman becomes a legal reason for disqualification from authority, from the ability to give gifts, from the ability to hold authority in various different ways, and particularly over grain and land. And this structure of colonial misogyny is consolidated by the Permanent Settlement, 1793, where Article 20 or Clause 20 of 1793 Permanent Regulation put women, minors and idiots in the same strength. So women, minors, women, children and idiots are all disqualified, and we are all made one equivalent to the other. And this structure, therefore, is precisely what we are then left to work with. From 1793, very dramatically, by 1810, if you actually map the number of years, within about 20 odd years, women's names begin to move out of the zamindari khata into what are contested terrains or types of contestation. That's the court, and the court of war is an institution that is established in 1790 to precisely control these women authored or disqualified estates, proprietors' estates. You know how that works, right? Colonial governments put their own men in authority, and therefore women may continue to live on that land, but they don't get to exercise authority in any way on it. And so what we have then is a structure in which we have records. The Bajajuni doctor tells us that these women were there, they were authoritative figures, etc. till 1793. From 1793, this is what begins to happen. By 1810, their names begin to move from the site of proprietorship and management into those of victims pleading before court for basic mashahara, that is monthly maintenance. They become pleaders. They are made dependent upon colonial largesse. And subsequently, this is the terrain, exactly the same land, the Lakhiraj land of the women, the Deori land of the women, is precisely what is given over from 1780 through the opium fields and the indigo market. Indigo cultivation is done also by the private capitalists of that generation, i.e. men like Adni, Harrington. Adni and Harrington are major indigo planters of their time, 1790s. Adni and Harrington are given these lands or buy up these lands, but they're not just buying up lands that were held by the women. They are also employing in their own indigo establishments men we have all praised as good men. William Carey, the Baptist missionary who is supposed to have given us print, the Baptist missionary who has given us knowledge of Bengali literacy. Men like Carey begin their lives in Bengal on the establishment of these indigo merchants and manufacturing units. Of course, Carey is trying to learn Sanskrit, but even in 1799 he confesses that he knows nothing of Sanskrit, and yet it is Carey who begins the first and volatile attack on quote-unquote sati or widow immolation. So neither on the basis of technical linguistic competence nor on the basis of deep familiarity with kinship structure or with monastic governmentality itself as a structure or horizon within which these acts of gift-giving, protest, land, etc. are mixed together. The attack on widow immolation begins from this moment. 1789 is the first Holbrook's writing on this. 1799 is the first evangelical attack on widow immolation. And it's this confabulation of or convergence of evangelical come liberal thought and writing, which then becomes the mode out of which colonial mal-education is put forward. Okay? And I'm going to call it mal-education because I do believe that the very fact that you have left it to me till this late to begin to think about this as a possibility or to investigate the conditions under which these women might have been protesting indicates the long history of ignorance that we have actually been trained into by a certain liberal evangelical convergence of what is the good and who's good and what is the economic actor and to what end is all action to be directed. The very fact that we cannot in fact conceive of gift giving in this entire continuum of land, herd and people and objects, within which therefore women's actions were conditioned and enacted, means that we have a long way to go before we recover from a certain kind of making of colonial ignorance. And that is the place that I'm trying to now understand and excavate about the making of postcolonial ignorance. So this is the third part of where I'm trying to go, and I would love to hear your questions so that I can think a little more clearly about this. To me, it seems that from one part of the making of postcolonial ignorance should begin with the very moment in the late 18th century when the attack and dispersal on the monastic governmental order begins with the resumption of land. That you can trace. But what happens is, to my mind, a second formation whose influence we see in the current controversy about what is history, what is vernacular history. I'm thinking, of course, of David Curley's work. I'm thinking about Chatterjee's latest work. Alas, Kumkum is not with us anymore, but Kumkum had done this work on the poetry of kings. And this entire controversy about how do we read these narratives, who are the authors of such histories, are these histories at all? I think that very problem would not have existed if those monastic clerics, traders, merchants, warriors had not been actually killed fairly substantially in the late 18th century itself. I can say this for Tikra because in the case of the Tikra Chronicles, the Rajamala and the Krishnamala, there has been an enormous nationalist outpouring on the fact that none of these chronicles are history or historical. However, all the clues within the chronicles are about the fact that their authors and the subjects of these chronicles are monks. They name themselves as either sannyasis or vairagis, or they talk about akhadas, they talk about kapaliks, they talk about various groups and conflicts between them. So the inability to recognize historical chronicles or chronicles as histories of monastic orders must also then be located in that late 18th century moment when the monks are destroyed, their lands are resumed for taxation purposes. So the authority and the ability to understand their artifacts is also dispersed. And so there is a second implication for method for us today and in the construction of postcolonial ignorance, that we can look at this entire series of chronicles and not recognize are we up? Is the time up? Okay, that's I think a clue. I should shut up. That we look at the record and we don't actually recognize that these are chronicles of monastic governmentality. And in that lack of recognition lies the trace of our postcolonial ignorance. That's the order that I'm trying to work with. Okay? And I would love to hear your thoughts and questions on this so that I can think more clearly in the future. Thank you for your patience.